With carp fishing becoming more and more popular and the lakes getting more and more busy, it's becoming increasingly difficult to catch carp, especially if you fish like everybody else. So in this video, I'm going to give you 15 tips and edges that will help you stand out from the crowd, fish differently to everyone else, and most importantly, catch more carp.
Now, one of the biggest edges in carp fishing has got to be baiting up. I'm walking around my local club lake here, and I'm just going to trickle a few boilies into a few spots that I might fish later in the week. Not many people do this, and not many people spend the time to do the sort of extra prep work on the sessions. And I think this can really be an edge, because the fish can feed on your bait whilst they're not being fished for and get confident in it. And then when you put rigs in position, you only use a few baits around it, and the fish are used to finding the bait in those spots, and they're more likely to pick them up. Going to get blown away in a minute, it's pretty windy, but I'm going to get a few of these baits in, and hopefully next time I'm down the lake, the fish will be happily feeding on those spots and I can hopefully catch them.
When I first started carp fishing, like a lot of people, I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and it seemed to me that most videos showed a lot of bait being used, you know, spodding out, making up mixes, getting a lot of bait out there to bring the fish into your swim and get them feeding. And I tried this and it wasn't that successful for me. And then I was fishing the water on the Isle of Wight, Ruckley Country Park, and I saw a guy putting out maybe 5 or 6 baits around each rod, and he was catching quite well. So my next session down there, I tried the same thing, 5 or 6 baits, a little bit of crumb and a tiny handful of pellets, and I managed to catch 21 fish in a 72-hour session, which was a real eye-opener for me. It made me realise that actually if the fish are there already, you don't need a lot of bait to get them feeding, you just need enough to nick a bite. Once you've caught a fish, you can obviously introduce another bit of bait, try and nick another bite. If the fish are really having it, yes, you can use a lot more bait, but really you just want to make sure you've got enough bait on the right spot to get a bite. Finding the fish is much more important than using a lot of bait. If the fish are already there, you don't need to feed them, you just need to catch them. A few years ago, I read a book by Ian Chilcott, I think it's called Light My Fire or something like that, and he talks about the spaghetti trick. Now bear with me, this is an interesting one. So what you do is you get 2 boilies and you attach them together with a piece of spaghetti in the middle, and that forms a double bait, and then you fire those out and you fish a double bait on the rig. So instead of having single baits dotted around your swim, you've got double baits, something the carp never see, and it's completely different to what everyone else is doing. So it might just trip up those wary fish that aren't used to seeing that presentation. Don't worry that the spaghetti is going to damage or harm the fish in any way. It's made of wheat, which is in a lot of bait and pellets anyway, so it's not going to do the fish any harm, but it's simply a way of attaching 2 baits together so they can get down to the bottom and form double baits on the bottom as opposed to single baits. Most people in carp fishing will use single boilies, fire them out, and then fish a pop-up over the top. It seems to be the standard way a lot of people fish these days. If you use double baits and then a double bait on your rig, it's completely different and it will really trip up those wary carp.
Right, this next tip, guys, is an interesting one. I want you to think about leads, and how many people do you know that use a 3-ounce lead in the fishing? Now obviously, if everyone's using 3-ounce leads, the fish come tuned to it, and every time they pick up a rig, they're used to shaking the weight of a 3-ounce lead, and quite often they get away with it. I was reading Frank Warwick's book, Every Bit of Blue, and he talks about using heavy leads, you know, 5-6 ounces, and doing really well. And there's a bit about Bluebell Lakes where he's fishing there, and I think he's caught a few fish, and the other guys on the lake are struggling. So one of the guys came round to him, and he asked him, what are you doing, mate? How come you're catching all these fish? And Frank, being the sort of generous and honest guy that he is, he told him, I'm using heavy leads, mate. I'm using 5 ounces. And he actually gave the guy a couple of leads, and the guy went on to...
A bit like those.
Oh, hello. Nice one, thanks for that. I'll use them in a minute. So he gave the guy some 5-ounce leads, and he went on to catch a couple of fish. And it just shows you that using a lead that's different to everyone else can really trip the fish up if they're used to dealing with the same size leads all the time. So it's not just heavy leads, you can go the other way and use a lighter lead like a 1 ounce. So give that a bit of thought, guys. If everyone on your water's using 3-ounce leads, why not go the other way and go really, really heavy or really, really light? And it might just trip up those wary fish and help you catch a few more.
Right, for this next one, guys, I am down at the mighty Elstow,
on pit 2, and this is a water that is over 20 acres in size, 35 to 40 feet deep, and crystal clear water. And this tip is all about zig fishing. So many people these days still don't bother using zigs. Water like this, you've got such a depth of water that the fish aren't going to be on the bottom feeding very often. So with a zig, you can really search those depths and try and locate the depth that the fish are at, especially in the winter, you know, when they're trying to find that warm layer of water. Fishing adjustable zigs, particularly on a deep water like this, can be really effective at finding where the fish are. But on shallower lakes, particularly clear lakes, I always like a clear lake for zig fishing so the fish can actually see the bait. If it's clouded up like a clay sort of pond, you know, they're not really going to be able to see it, so I don't normally bother, and you're more likely to foul hook fish on lakes like that. But clear waters, where the fish are swimming around off the bottom all the time, you know, having a zig out there when you're not expecting a bite on the bottom can be a real massive edge. And if you never cast one out, you'll never know. So give zigs a go, guys. You can tip them off with maggots if you want, just use a bit of black foam on its own, or use a little pop-up, any colour you want as well. Black is really good, but I know people who do well on white, and yellow as well, particularly if the water likes corn and things like that. But experiment with them, guys, give them a go, and you never know, it might just change your fishing this year. Right, the next point I want to make, and this is a good one, especially on pressured lakes, is to fish in the quieter swims. So quite often on lakes you get those swims that are the absolute favoured swims, and quite often on day tickets especially, people are almost queuing up to get in those swims. And obviously the fish are going to move away from that pressure and go into sanctuary in sort of quieter areas, under bushes, in snags, that sort of thing. So it really pays to walk around your lake before you decide where you're going to fish, and just look in all the areas, particularly corners of lakes on day tickets. Everyone's fishing out in the middle, and if you've got overhanging trees and snags and stuff in the corners, quite often fish will spend a lot of their time in those areas and feed in and around those snags and barely ever move out. So you've got to look for those types of areas where people don't often fish. That's what I'm trying to say. So on this lake particularly, you've got a lot of well-established swims, you know, they're well built with wood chip and everything, and everyone's sort of fishing to the island. But a lot of people will neglect the corners and the margins because they just don't think to fish there. Now where I am now, you can see in this corner behind me here, you've got this nice bush there, and it is overhanging the water. And a lot of the time, especially in the summer, I've walked around this lake and I've seen fish just sat in under the trees under there. So quite often from my swim where I am, I can boat one in under there, and it's quite safe because they've removed all the reeds now that used to be here. So there's no danger of the fish sort of getting into a snag or anything like that. I can fish a nice tight line to it, and quite often that will pick up bonus fish where the rods on the island are being quiet, you know. So it's not just fishing quiet swims, but it's also fishing quiet spots within swims that you're fishing. So once you get set up and everything, it's well worth, before you getting the rods out, just trying to think where other people wouldn't necessarily fish. If you've got a baiting pole or something like that, it can be really good to sort of ship it along the margin and underneath a bush or something like that, where no one could realistically cast to. As long as it's safe, you know, you've got to make sure that the fish isn't going to come into any trouble once you hook it. You've got to make sure you can land the fish, that's the most important thing. But if you can put a rig and some bait where no one else has really fished before, quite often the fish will be a lot more comfortable feeding there, and you've got a much better chance of catching them. Right, the next tip is all about baiting approach. Now, I don't mean what type of bait you're using, but I mean more about the spread of bait that you're using. So a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I went to Bluebell Lakes, and I'd never been there before. The complex was absolutely rammed and there was barely a swim free on the whole place. So I walked around, I think kingfisher was spawning, and some of the other lakes were absolutely full. The only swims that I could get was on San Martin Lake. Now, I watched the water for a long time and I noticed that everyone seemed to be spodding out in the middle, and I figured that the fish were wary to that because no one seemed to be catching anything. And if everyone's spodding on your lake, you know, you're going to have a lot of tight patches of bait, and the fish become wary of that. So what I did was I fished in the margins with just a tiny, tiny little scattering of bait, a few pellets, a few broken baits, and then I used a little plastic pellet as a hook bait, really inconspicuous and barely any bait at all, so you're not alarming the fish. And I managed to catch a 34 pounder on my first night.
Well guys, first night at Bluebell Lakes. We've had a bit of a result.
And there's guys that have been there for a week and not caught anything, you know, and I'm not bragging, I'm just trying to point out to you that if you fish the same as everyone else, you may well struggle, especially if the fish are pressured like they are on Bluebell Lakes. So I went against the grain, you know, used tiny little traps in the margins, barely any bait at all, barely enough to even alert the fish to any danger, and just scattered it around a little bit more so it wasn't such a honed in area like you do with a spod mix, and managed to catch that nice 34 pounder. You might have seen that on my channel if you saw the road trip from about 3 years ago. So yeah, the point I'm getting across is that you need to fish differently in terms of your baiting approach and the spread of your bait. If everyone's fishing tight patches of bait, you know, bait boats and spodding, then use a spread of boilies, and the fish feel a lot more confident feeding over that because it's not such a tight area. And on the other side, if everyone's using a spread of boilies on your lake, then why not try a bait boat if you're allowed, or a tight patch of bait with a spod or that sort of thing, you know, little patches of bait rather than a whole load of bait in one area, and it really can make a difference. Right, the next tip, guys, is all about lead arrangements. When I first started carp fishing, like a lot of people, I used to use a lead clip setup just like this one, and what I found was I was getting a lot of false takes, a lot of bleeps and indications, but not actually hooking that many fish. And I think what was happening was the fish was picking it up, you know, shaking their head and using the weight of the lead to get away with it. And what I decided to do was take the pin out of the lead clip so it then becomes a running rig like this. Most people on the lakes that you're fishing will be using lead clips in the conventional way with the pin in, or they're using the lead clips with a fixed swivel. And so unless the lead comes off the clip, then the fish can use that weight to shake the rig out. But if you fish it running style like this, can't use the weight of the lead, so there's no pivot point for it to get rid of the hook. It doesn't have to be a lead clip like this. You can use an inline lead, and if you put a tail rubber over your swivel before you push it into the lead, it'll pull out nice and easily. Right, no carp fishing tips video would be complete without talking about bait choice. Now, most people these days are using bait from a couple of the biggest companies, and most lakes you go to will have seen that bait go in. So a lot of people think, well, if the bait's going into the lake anyway, people are kind of pre-baiting for you, and you know, why not get on the same bait as everyone else, and you'll probably catch the same as everyone else. Well, that's not what I want really. I don't want to catch the same as everyone else. I want to catch more fish than anyone and have a bait that only I'm using on the lake really. So I tend to use baits that not many people are using on the lakes near me, so that I feel like that is slightly different, and it might again trip up the fish that are used to seeing the same bait time and time again. So I'm using you know, good quality freezer baits that I know has got really good food in it, and trickling that into the lake so the fish are used to eating it. And believe me, it's caught me a fair few extra fish over the years using something slightly different to everyone else. You can also try going away from round boilies and breaking them up into pieces or halves, using crumb, this sort of thing, because fish are definitely getting wise to round balls being dangerous in a fishing situation. Now, it doesn't just mean boilies, I'm talking about other bait as well. If everyone on your lake is using boilies, why not try a particle approach with fake corn or something like that, or use something like tiger nuts if you're allowed to, and maize and things like this. Or you could completely go the other way and use old school baits like lunch and meat, you know, bits of pepperami, things like that. Just think about what everyone else is doing on the lake. Try to kind of talk to people as you walk around, and you know, you're not kind of asking people what they're doing particularly, but quite often people will talk about what bait they're using, and just build up a picture when you go to your lake of what people are doing, and then try and do something different. Just anything to be different to everyone else so that you can really make your own way on the lake and catch different fish to everyone else, and hopefully more fish than everyone else. Now, I recently posted a video where I tried match the hatch against a bright pop-up, and the result blew me away. I ended up catching a fish that had only been caught 3 times in the last 5 years, the biggest common in the lake. So if you haven't seen that, I'll link that video below. But what that shows you is matching the hatch can really trip up those fish that don't get caught very often. You know, the bright hook bait really can sort of spook off those older, more wise fish. And how many times have you seen on underwater footage, you know, the fish come into a spot and they avoid the bright ones, particularly popped up baits. Anything that stands out over the loose feed, they can avoid it, and they'll eat everything else around and just leave your hook bait in position. So I think if you're feeding, you know, sort of baits straight out the bag and the fish are going to come in and eat them, why wouldn't they eat your hook bait as well? For years, I always felt like you had to sort of tip off your baits with something bright, like a bit of fake corn or, you know, pop up to make a snowman rig or something like that. And I always wanted my hook bait to stand out and be bright. But actually, I think that is actually going against you and making the fish realise which the hook bait is. So if you fish one that looks the same as your freebies, you're much more likely to pick up bigger fish and the older, wiser fish as well. I want to talk to you about natural baits. Now, most people don't want to bother with worms and maggots and things like that in the fishing throughout the year. Yes, in the winter, a lot of people will use maggots, but if you go to a lake that doesn't have a lot of nuisance fish and, you know, a lot of silvers and things like that, then maggots and worms and stuff like that will 100% outscore other baits from big tackle companies. You know, pellets and boilies and things like this are great baits, nice and convenient, but really the carp want to feed on natural food. They want to grub around in the bottom and find insects and larvae and things like that. And especially if the lake is switched off and the fish don't seem to be feeding on bait, then using something that matches their natural food can really help you catch those extra fish. You can buy things like bloodworm nowadays, and that is one of the biggest natural food sources in lakes, particularly in the autumn. I find the bloodworms really effective. Now, one of the things I like to do is get boilie crumb and add bloodworm to it and mix that in. So you're getting a bit of kind of food content and bulk into the bait, and then the bloodworm is the sort of natural attraction that can bring the fish in and get them grubbing around. And then using really small hook baits over the top of that in the silt can really be effective. So don't just use bait from your tackle shop, you know, think about other baits that the fish will be naturally feeding on. I remember reading sort of John Wilson's books and things back in the day, and he talks about using slugs and other baits such as shellfish and things like that. Just anything to be different to what everyone else is doing, because I bet you if you go to most day ticket lakes and ask to see in people's buckets, they're either going to be using boilies and pellets, or they're going to be using particle or a mixture of all of it together. And not many people are going to be using kind of naturals, especially in warmer months. But if you've got lakes where, you know, a lot of lakes now are just carp fisheries with not a lot of other species in the lake, then why not use maggots all year round if you're allowed to? Right, the next tip is all about the size of your bait. I remember fishing a water when I used to live in Brighton a few years ago, just in East Sussex, a nice little syndicate lake that I used to fish. And everyone seemed to be using the same 15mm bottom baits with a little snowman over the top. And, you know, a few people were catching fish, but it did get harder on there. And then I was chatting to a guy that was doing really well, and he said he was using 20mm baits, and it's not something I'd done before. So I gave it a go on my next session, and I caught the biggest common in the lake and a couple of other fish as well. And from there, I went on to catch most of the lake's stock in one season, just fishing 20mm baits over a scattering of the same bait. And I was baiting up with the bigger baits as well. And I think what happened was the fish were feeding on my bait while I was baiting up, getting used to those bigger baits and not getting caught. And then when I came to fish with those bigger baits, they were a lot less cautious, and it enabled me to catch some of the A-team and quite a few of the other fish as well. So just try bigger baits and I think you will be thanking me for it. Right, one way that I've found is really successful to target particularly larger fish in pressured lakes is to wash out your bait. Now if you imagine everyone goes fishing, they're using boilies straight out the bag, they're firing them into the lake, little patch of boilies and then fishing the rigs over the top. And the carp are very used to this situation and they're very clever at learning that that's dangerous. They know that bait's there, but they don't necessarily feed on it straight away. Then a couple of days later, maybe 3 or 4 days later, they'll come in and if the bait's still there, it will have washed out, lost a lot of its flavour and sort of gone soft and easier to eat and obviously safer because there's less likely someone's fishing there. So you can mimic that situation by soaking your baits in lake water before your session. So when you arrive at the lake, the baits are already washed out, they've lost quite a lot of their flavour and they've gone soft and mushy. And this, when you put into the lake, it's already like a safe bait for the fish and they're going to assume that that's safe to eat. So you're more likely to get them to feed on it a lot quicker. You're not waiting for it to wash out when it gets into the lake, it's already done for you. And quite often, bigger fish, they prefer a softer bait because their pharyngeal teeth are kind of worn out from, 20, 30, 40 years of chewing up hard things in the lake, crustaceans, crayfish, that sort of thing. Their teeth are kind of worn out and it sounds silly, but as we get older, our teeth kind of wear out and the same happens with carp really. Give that a go guys and it might just catch you a few extra fish. Right, the next tip I want to talk about is rig length. How many people do you think are using rigs of around about 8 inches? It's pretty much the standard these days, whatever the situation. Most people are using rigs of about that length. So I reckon if you go against the grain and fish either a really short rig or a really long rig, you've got a much better chance of tripping up the fish because they're going to be used to dealing with a rig of around about 8 inches and they know how much they can move before they hit the lead. So they get used to kind of sucking and blowing and getting rid of rigs based on that length. So if you have a really, really short rig, they've got nowhere to go before they get hooked. They only move a tiny little bit and they're going to come in contact with the lead. On the other side of that, if you use a really long rig, they're going to be lulled into a false sense of security because they're going to move, not feel anything, and they'll pick up speed and then they'll hit the lead and they'll be moving and they'll hook themselves against it. So on your next session, try messing around with the length of your rigs, particularly if your baiting situation dictates it. So if you're spreading your bait out, scattering boilies around, try using a really long rig, kind of 12 to 14 inches. And then on small patches of bait, if you're fishing over a little bit of spod mix on a tight area, try a really short rig down to like 3 or 4 inches and just see if it makes a difference, because I've done this in the past and I found that a longer rig particularly is effective because not many people do it these days, so the fish aren't used to dealing with it. Right guys, the next tip that I can give you is to visit the lake between sessions for the purpose of mapping out the swims. So what you want to do is carry your marker float and a notepad and wrap sticks in your car all the time, and then whenever you're passing the lake, if it's local to you, pop in. If no one's fishing, spend a couple of hours, walk around every swim, cast a marker out and just find features, find the distance to an island, find any open water spots, gravel, clear spots in the weed, wrap them up on your sticks and mark them down. And that way you're building up a picture of the lake so that when you actually come to fishing, you can wrap your rods out very quickly, no disturbance, get them straight out on the spots and you're fishing. And this can be a massive edge because obviously if you turn up a lake, you've never wet a line there before, you don't know what's out in front of you. You might spend 3 or 4 hours trying to find a clear spot in weed, by which time you've spooked off every fish in the lake down the other end. But if you've got your spots all wrapped out, your lines marked and clipped up, you can pop them out there, even if you arrive in the dark, get them out on your spots and you're fishing straight away without any disturbance. And it's very quick and you're going to get a lot more time actually fishing and watching the water. So spend a bit of time in between sessions, walk around, chat to people, see if anything's been caught, do your research online as well, but most importantly, visit the lake and map it out with your marker rod, and it will pay dividends in the long run. So basically what I'm saying guys is to really think about your fishing. Try to find out what other people are doing, watch what people are doing, and do everything in your power to fish differently to everyone else. I hope these tips have been helpful for you. Make sure you check out these other videos with more helpful carp fishing tips to hopefully help you put more fish on the bank. Thanks very much for watching, and tight lines.